The anonymous letter lands on the dinner table, just as Emily raises a toast to 20 years of trust. Inside, bank statements, signatures, dates. Every dollar Sarah stole from the family company 2 decades ago, before she vanished and returned as the perfect aunt. Emily's hand stops mid-air, champagne trembling at the rim. Sarah doesn't even lift her eyes. She just says, silk soft, "You weren't supposed to open that until I was dead." The glass slips, shatters, and the lies holding this family together crack with it. One letter, 20 years. And Emily finally knows where her college fund went the week Sarah disappeared. Now the only question is who reaches for the knife first. "I can't believe you kept this from us all these years." Emily's fork paused midway to her mouth, the steam from the roast beef curling lazily around it like a question mark. The dining room, with its polished oak table scarred from decades of meals, felt smaller now, the walls pressing in with faded family photos that smiled too brightly, their edges yellowed and unrelenting. She set the fork down, her napkin twisting in her lap, fingers seeking the familiar weave to steady the knot in her chest. Closure. That's what she wanted tonight. Words that could mend the frayed edges of their bond, pull them back from the brink of silence amid the heavy scent of gravy clinging to the air. David cleared his throat, his broad shoulders hunching over his plate as if shielding the food from view. The knife in his hand scraped against porcelain, a deliberate grind that echoed his inner churn, sharp and grating in the tense hush. He'd planned this dinner to be a shield, a barrier against the old wounds that clawed at his children. But now, his eyes flicked to Sarah across the table, resentment bubbling up from the grave of his own childhood betrayals, hot and acrid. "Pass the potatoes," he muttered, voice low, as if normalcy could glue the evening back together. He wouldn't let it shatter them, not on his watch. His kids needed him solid, unyielding, even as the room's dim light cast long, accusing shadows. Sarah's laugh came out brittle, forced, like glass underfoot crunching in the quiet. She unfolded the letter with hands that betrayed no tremor, practice from years of steering conversations her way. The envelope had arrived mid-bite, slipped under the door by some anonymous courier, its cream paper unassuming until the words spilled out. A confession from 20 years ago, her hand in the till of the family business, siphoning funds to cover a debt she'd buried deeper than regret. Betrayal, plain as the ink, stark against the faded lamplight. She needed them to see it wasn't malice, just survival. A mistake craving understanding amid the cloying aroma of overcooked carrots. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice threading sympathy into the air, eyes wide with that practiced vulnerability. "I was young, desperate. Dad, you know how things were back then." Her words trailing into the thick, oppressive air. The words hung, absorbed into the thick scent of gravy and overcooked carrots. The kind of meal that promised comfort, but delivered weight, settling heavy in their lungs. Emily leaned forward, her pulse a quiet drum against her temples, steady but insistent. Hesitation clawed at her. Confront or retreat? The family facade, that polished surface of holidays and shared laughs, cracked now under the letter's glare, fragments glinting in the low light. She wanted trust rebuilt, brick by careful brick. But the fear of rejection loomed, a shadow whispering she'd be left alone in the ruins, isolated in the room's closing walls. "Sarah, why now, after all this time?" David's chair creaked as he shifted, his fork stabbing into a potato with more force than necessary, the impact jarring through the wood. Overwhelmed, yes, but he'd fight for them, his resolve hardening against the rising tide. His own parents' ghosts, lies and abandonments, mirrored in this revelation, fueling a defensiveness that bordered on fury, bitter and unyielding. "Enough," he growled, though his tone softened at the edges, a father's plea masked as command, voice rough in the stifling air. "We're not doing this here. Not like this." Yet the secret festered, unease seeping through the room like damp through cracked plaster, turning every glance into accusation, every breath into calculation, the atmosphere thickening with unspoken dread. Sarah reached across, her fingers brushing Emily's sleeve, a manipulative tether disguised as sisterly warmth, the fabric rough under her touch. "Please, Em. I did it for us, for the family. Validate that, at least." Guilt twisted her features, insecurity etching lines around her mouth, but beneath it, the drive to be seen, forgiven, pulsed like a hidden wound. Emily pulled back, not sharply, but enough to widen the gulf, the space between them growing colder. The letter lay open between the candlesticks, its edges curling in the draft from the window, whispering secrets in the chill. Hope flickered there, fragile as the flame. Perhaps this fracture could lead to mending, to truce that bound rather than broke. But the tension coiled tighter, oppressive in the dim light, each word a contemplative step toward the abyss, measured and heavy. The meal continued, utensils clinking like hesitant heartbeats, the secret shadow lengthening across the table, dark and encroaching. The words lingered like a bitter aftertaste, the dining room's shadows lengthening as the meal dissolved into strained silence, the air growing heavier with each passing second. Emily's fork clattered softly against her plate, but it was Alex who absorbed the shock deepest, suspicion rooting in his chest like thorns amid the oppressive haze of half-truths, pricking relentlessly. Hours blurred in the house's heavy stillness, faded photos mocking from the walls, their smiles frozen in judgment. His mind a contemplative churn of fractured memories. Yet a fragile hope flickered. Confrontation might pierce the veil, if only he pressed forward, through the thickening fog. "Mom, Dad, what the hell was in that letter? You can't just drop this bomb and expect us to swallow it whole." Michael's voice sliced through the clatter of silverware scraping plates, his knuckles whitening around the stem of his water glass, the cool surface slick under pressure. The roast beef sat congealing in the center of the table, its juices pooling like unspoken accusations, the scent of rosemary now cloying, sticking to the back of throats like regret. David shifted in his chair, the wooden legs groaning under his weight, his eyes flicking toward the window where the curtains hung limp, blocking out the evening's dim light, trapping the tension inside. He wanted to shield them, Michael, Emily, all of them, from the rot he'd buried deep. The same poison his own father had force-fed him years ago, bitter and lingering. But here it was, bubbling up, threatening to drown everything in its slow, inexorable rise. Sarah's hand fluttered to her necklace, twisting the chain until the skin beneath reddened, a faint sting grounding her. "Michael, honey, it's complicated. We were protecting you." Her words came soft, laced with that familiar plea, the one that always tugged at sympathies, drawing eyes to her wide, glistening ones in the flickering candlelight. Guilt gnawed at her insides, a familiar ache from choices she'd made in the shadows of their marriage. Nights when she'd whispered manipulations to keep the peace, or worse, to bend it her way, the memory sharp as broken glass. She leaned forward, voice dropping to a hush, as if volume alone could rewrite the past, her breath warm against the cooling air. "The letter was from your grandfather. Old hurts. Nothing that changes who we are now." David's fork clinked against porcelain, too loud in the sudden hush, the sound reverberating off the walls. He felt the walls of the room contract, the faded wallpaper peeling at the edges like flaking skin, revealing the decay beneath their polished life, musty and exposed. "Enough, Sarah. Michael, you don't need to dig this up." His tone was steady, but inside defensiveness coiled tight, fear that admitting the truth would fracture him in their eyes, make him the failure his own parents had branded him, the shame hot and suffocating. Resentment flickered, unbidden, toward the ghosts of his upbringing, the betrayals that had wired him to guard his kids with iron walls. Yet Michael's gaze bored into him, sharp and unyielding, stirring a suspicion that twisted like a knife. Did his son see through the facade already? See the man who repeated the sins he swore to escape, in the dim, judgmental light? Michael didn't back down, though his pulse hammered in his ears, the steam from the untouched potatoes blurring the edges of his vision. warm and distorting. Harmony. That's all he'd ever chased, swallowing his own jagged pains to keep the family stitched together, the effort leaving him hollow. But tonight, the shock from Emily's stunned silence across the table pushed him forward, his passive shell cracking under the weight, fissures spreading. Protecting us? From what? Your lies? Emily's right. We've lived in the dark too long. If that letter's about Dad's side or something you both hid, just say it before this tears us apart. His words hung, probing, laced with doubt that seeped into every corner like damp rot. Suspicion bloomed in his chest, not just of the letter's secrets, but of the parents who'd built their world on half-truths, the foundation shifting uneasily. Emily nodded faintly, her fork abandoned, the family's fractures spiderwebbing outward, visible in the strained light. Sarah's eyes darted between them, seeking an ally, her manipulative instinct urging her to pivot, paint herself the victim, draw Michael back into her orbit, the pull instinctive and desperate. I was young, scared. We both were. Please, let's not ruin this dinner. But her voice wavered, insecurity bleeding through, the fear of judgment coiling her tighter, a vice around her chest. David met Michael's stare, the oppressive quiet amplifying the creak of the house settling around them, each groan a reminder of instability. For a heartbeat, he glimpsed a path forward, not erasure, but honesty. A fragile hope that confession might mend what was breaking, faint but persistent. The letter. It was about money. Your grandfather cutting us off, calling me unworthy. I didn't want you carrying that shame. The admission slipped out, raw, his shadow resentment surfacing like bile, sour in his mouth. Suspicion lingered in Michael's narrowed eyes, but beneath it, a tentative light, perhaps the first step toward something whole. The table fell silent again, the air thick with the weight of truths half unveiled, the family teetering on the edge of collapse or rebirth, balanced precariously. The silence after Michael's outburst thickened like smoke, suffusing the dining room with an oppressive weight that pressed on every chest, heavy and unrelenting. Alex's pulse quickened, fear coiling in his gut amid the flickering candlelight, the family's guarded glances betraying fractures long buried, sharp and hidden. Beneath the cloying rosemary haze, fragile hopes for truth flickered, even as tempers simmered toward eruption, wounds itching to surface like old scars reopening. What the hell was in that letter, Mom? And why are you both acting like it's nothing? Emily's voice cracked the fragile quiet, her fork hovering midair over a half-eaten slice of potato, steam rising in lazy curls that blurred her vision, warm and veiling. The dining room walls, papered in faded florals, seemed to press inward, the chandelier above casting jagged shadows across the linen tablecloth, like fractures in porcelain, stark and unforgiving. Sarah's hand paused on her wineglass, the deep red liquid sloshing gently, catching the light in a way that mimicked fresh blood, viscous and ominous. Sarah swallowed, her throat working visibly under the strain of a smile that didn't reach her eyes, forced and brittle. Emily, sweetheart, it's old history, nothing to dredge up now, not at dinner. But her words came out too soft, laced with that familiar plea, the one she wielded like a shield, guilty eyes darting to Michael for backup, seeking the validation she craved, even as her fingers twisted the napkin in her lap, betraying the insecurity gnawing at her core like persistent rot. She leaned forward, voice dropping to a manipulative hush. We all make mistakes. You know that better than anyone. Michael shifted in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, his face a mask of forced calm, lines deepening in the low light. He wanted this to end, to smooth it over with platitudes and seconds of pie, anything to keep the family from splintering like dry bone under pressure. But the fear clawed at him. Disintegration, the word echoing in his mind as he avoided the pain staring back from each face, raw and exposed. Let's not do this, he murmured, passive as ever, his eyes fixed on the congealing roast, juices now a cold, accusatory sheen glinting dully. Emily, pass the bread? We can talk later. No, Dad, not later. Now. Emily's hesitation fractured, her anxiety bubbling into something sharper, her drive for closure pushing her forward, despite the terror of rejection twisting in her gut, cold and vice-like. She set the fork down with a clink that reverberated like a gavel through the tense air. The scent of overcooked carrots mingled with the metallic tang of fear sweat, oppressive in the close air, making her chest tighten with each labored breath. Unresolved issues she'd buried for years clawed their way up, nights alone while they whispered behind doors. The abandonment that left scars deeper than words, aching and fresh. That letter from Grandma? It wasn't just history. It was about you leaving us, Mom. For him. She jabbed a finger toward Michael, who flinched but said nothing, enabling the silence that had always festered, a stagnant pool. Sarah's facade cracked, color draining from her cheeks as judgment loomed in Emily's stare, heavy and unyielding. I was young, lost. I came back, didn't I? For you. But the manipulation soured, her voice trembling with the shadow of her own deceptions, the sympathy she fished for slipping away like smoke. Tears welled, not from remorse, but from the rejection she dreaded most, stinging hot. Michael finally spoke, his stress fracturing into a rare edge, voice roughened by the strain. Enough. This family stays together. Yet his words rang hollow, his avoidance crumbling as old wounds reopened, the pain he'd numbed for years now raw, threatening the harmony he'd clung to like a lifeline in the dark. Emily's breath hitched, fear coiling cold in her veins. Abandonment, real and immediate, in the widening cracks between them, gaping and cold. But amid the tension, a fragile hope flickered. Truth, finally spoken, might mend what silence had broken, a faint glow in the gloom. The argument swelled, voices overlapping in a gritty cacophony of accusations and pleas. The table a battlefield of unspoken terrors, each word peeling back layers until only raw emotion remained, exposed and throbbing. The silence thickened like smoke from the cooling potatoes, coiling around the table's edges where shadows clawed at the fraying wallpaper, insistent and dark. Emily's unanswered plea echoed in her chest, a raw pulse of confusion twisting into something sharper, more corrosive, betrayal's first bitter bloom, acidic and unrelenting. Hours blurred into a sleepless vigil, the house groaning under the weight of buried truths, each creak amplifying the fracture lines in their fragile bonds, resonant and foreboding. By dawn's gray light, the air hummed with unspoken reckonings, a fragile hope flickering against the encroaching rift, tentative and dim. Alex shoved his chair back, the legs scraping against the worn oak floor like nails on chalkboard, harsh and grating. Forks clattered onto plates, and Emily's potato slice tumbled forgotten onto her napkin, gravy pooling dark and sticky, viscous in the low light. The dining room's faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, exposing plaster scarred by years of neglect, mirroring the raw edges of their unraveling secrets, rough and exposed. I can't do this anymore, Alex spat, his voice slicing through the steam still curling from the untouched casserole, hot and veiling. His knuckles whitened around the back of the chair, veins bulging like roots straining against soil, tense and unyielding. At 22, he carried the weight of unspoken inheritances. David's resentment, Michael's silences, Emily's hesitations, all festering into this moment, a slow-burning poison. That letter? The one you've all been dancing around like it's a goddamn landmine? If you don't spill it right now, every lie, every hidden hurt, I'm out. No more holidays, no more calls. We're done. David's fork froze midway to his mouth, a chunk of meat suspended, juices dripping onto the tablecloth in slow, accusatory patters, dark and relentless. His chest tightened, the familiar surge of defensiveness rising like bile, sour and choking. Protect the kids, that's what he'd sworn after his own parents' betrayals, the ones that left him hollow, repeating the cycle he despised, a vicious echo. But here was Alex, his youngest, eyes blazing with a pain David had tried to shield him from, fierce and piercing. Son, wait, David said, voice low and frayed. leaning forward as if his body could bridge the chasm, raw desperation in his tone. Overwhelmed, he scanned the faces around the table. Michael's averted gaze, Emily's wide eyes. Failing again, the fear gnawed deeper, insistent and cold. "We can talk this through. No need to—" "Talk?" Alex laughed, sharp and hollow, pacing now, his sneakers thudding dully on the threadbare rug, each step echoing tension. The air thickened with the scent of overcooked vegetables and cooling wax from the candles flickering on the sideboard, their flames casting elongated shadows that twisted like accusations, writhing in the dimness. "You've talked for years without saying shit. Dad, you act like shielding us makes you a hero, but it just buries everything deeper. And you, Michael, always smoothing edges, pretending the family's some fragile vase we can't bump. What about Mom's letter? The mistakes you all made before we were born." Emily's breath hitched, her hands twisting the napkin into knots, the fabric damp under her palms, clammy with anxiety. Closure, that's what she craved. A way to stitch the tears in their trust without ripping wider, delicate and urgent. But Alex's words struck like a blade, her fear of rejection coiling tight in her gut, a cold knot. Abandoned again, like the silences after Dad's late nights, Mom's tears she pretended not to hear, memories sharp as thorns. "Alex, please," she whispered, voice trembling but pushing forward, hesitant steps toward him amid the haze. "It's not that simple. We're trying. If we just—" Michael cleared his throat, the sound rasping like sandpaper, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm on the table, anything to maintain the harmony slipping through his grasp, frantic and failing. Stressed, passive, he'd enabled this for decades, swallowing his own pain to keep the peace. But now it choked him, thick in his throat. The shadow of his avoidance loomed, enabling the very disintegration he dreaded, a looming specter. "Everyone, sit," he urged, voice steady but eyes pleading, wide with strain. "Alex, your family. We don't cut ties over this." Yet inside, conflict brewed, a storm he couldn't quell, raging silently. Alex halted, chest heaving, the oppressive weight of their stares pressing down, heavy and unescapable. Betrayal etched his face, not just in the letter's ghost, but in the half-truths that had shaped him, deep and scarring. The room pulsed with unspoken pains, David's guarded flinches, Emily's averted pleas, Michael's forced calm. Unresolved conflicts hung like smoke, each breath drawing them deeper into the haze, suffocating. But in Alex's defiant spark, amid the tension, flickered something fragile. Hope. A thread of raw honesty that might yet bind them, if they dared grasp it, faint but insistent. He met their eyes, waiting, the line crossed but not severed, poised on the edge. The air hung heavy in the dining room, the scrape of the chair echoing into a void, as utensils lay forsaken amid congealing gravy, cold and accusing. One by one, eyes dropped to laps, shoulders hunching under the weight of buried guilts and fresh betrayals, the silence coiling like smoke around the peeling walls, thick and insidious. Alex lingered at the table's edge, resentment gnawing at his chest, a raw, isolating ache, while a fragile thread of hope tugged faintly against the encroaching dark, barely visible. Silence swallowed the dining room whole, the echo of Alex's chair legs fading into a void that pressed against Emily's chest like an unyielding hand, crushing and cold. She stared at the gravy stain on her napkin, its edges blurring as her breath shallowed. Each inhale pulling in the faint metallic tang of cooled meat and the sharper undercurrent of her own rising panic, acrid and rising. Around the table, forks lay abandoned, their tines glinting dully under the bulb's harsh glow, casting long shadows that twisted across the scarred wood like accusations unspoken, writhing and judgmental. David shifted first, his broad shoulders hunching as if to shield the space between him and the others. But the movement only amplified the creak of his chair, a low groan that sliced through the quiet, resonant and foreboding. He glanced at Sarah, then away, his eyes fixing on the half-eaten roast, its juices congealing into a waxy film, slick and unappetizing. This "This isn't helping," he muttered, voice rough as gravel, laced with the weight of years spent barricading his own fractures, heavy and worn. His drive to safeguard his children clawed at him now. But here, in this unraveling meal, protection felt like a crumbling wall. His resentment toward his parents' ghosts bleeding into the fear that he'd fail these kids the same way, leaving them exposed to the very betrayals he couldn't name, a bitter echo. Sarah's fingers curled around the stem of her water glass, not trembling, but gripping with a deliberate slowness that betrayed her inner churn, the cool glass slick against her skin. The cool condensation slicked her skin, a fleeting anchor against the guilt swelling in her gut, hot and insistent, churning relentlessly. She wanted their eyes on her, their understanding, but the silence stretched, forcing her to confront the manipulative whispers she'd used before to twist sympathy from pain, now echoing hollowly. "I didn't mean for it to go like this," she said softly, her words dropping like stones into still water, rippling without response, heavy in the hush. Insecurity gnawed at her edges. Judgment loomed in every averted gaze, and beneath it, the shadow of her old habits urged her to pivot, to plead. But she held back, the effort carving deeper lines into her face, etched with strain. Emily felt the isolation coil around Alex like smoke, though he sat rigid across from her, his knuckles whitening against the table's edge, tense and unyielding. She'd pushed for this dinner, this fragile bid at closure, yet her hesitation rooted her in place, avoiding the confrontation that might shatter the tentative threads of trust, fragile and fraying. Her fear of abandonment flickered. What if her silence now echoed as rejection? She opened her mouth, then closed it, the words tangling in her throat amid the oppressive hush, choked and futile. The room's stale air thickened with their collective retreat, each breath a reminder of hidden wounds. David's defensive walls, Sarah's insecure confessions, her own unresolved evasions. Resentment simmered in the gaps, not explosive, but insidious. A bitter undercurrent poisoning the hope she'd clung to, that speaking these truths might mend what silences had only frayed, a dim possibility. Alex's gaze darted between them, searching for a foothold in the void, but the family's withdrawal left him adrift, misunderstood in his raw outburst, isolated in the gloom. The unspoken conflicts hung there, heavy as the dust motes suspended in the light, each one a fragment of betrayal they all carried, weighty and cutting. Emily finally reached across, her hand brushing his sleeve, a small gesture laced with the faint spark of possibility amid the tension, warm but tentative. Yet the silence lingered, contemplative and unyielding, pressing them deeper into the grit of their shared fractures, where resentment festered but hope whispered of eventual release, soft and distant. The silence clawed deeper, Emily's panic curdling into a raw longing for the innocence that betrayal had stolen. Her fingers absently crumbling the stained napkin as shadows pooled like accusations across the table, dark and pooling. The air grew thicker, oppressive with the weight of buried truths. Her mind a contemplative whirl of fractured memories, tinged with desperate hope, swirling relentlessly. Time suspended in that tense void, pulling the family inexorably toward the shattering edge, inevitable and looming. Mia's voice sliced through the silence like a shard of glass underfoot, sharp and unbidden, cutting the hush. "I knew about the letters all along." The words hung there, raw, pulling every gaze to her small frame at the table's end, intense and focused. Emily's napkin crumpled in her fist, forgotten, as the room's stale air thickened with the scent of congealed gravy and unspoken accusations, heavy and cloying. David froze mid-reach for his water glass, his knuckles whitening against the wood, rigid with shock. Sarah's fork clattered against her plate, a metallic ping that echoed too long in the dim lamplight, reverberating. David's eyes narrowed, his drive to shield his children fracturing under the weight, cracking audibly in his mind. "Mia, what are you—" "No, Dad." Mia's chin lifted, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands clasped on the tablecloth, white-knuckled. "I found them in Mom's drawer last summer. The ones from Uncle Ray. I read every word. Sarah's face drained to ash, her insecurity blooming into a flush that crept up her neck, hot and revealing. She leaned forward, voice laced with that familiar plea for absolution, soft and coaxing. Sweetheart, you must have misunderstood. Those were just old things. Private. Michael shifted in his chair, his passive stress coiling tighter, fingers drumming a silent rhythm on his thigh, restless and tense. If I'd known you saw, I would have explained. I was young, lost. I just wanted someone to understand me. Her eyes glistened, seeking validation in the wreckage, yet beneath it, the shadow of control flickered, drawing them into her narrative, subtle and pulling. Michael's avoidance cracked. He met David's stare, his enabling facade splintering, lines deepening. She's right, though. I picked up the phone sometimes, thought it kept things calm. But it didn't. It just buried it deeper. The confession settled like dust after an explosion, each particle revealing fractures long ignored, fine and settling. Mia's revelation bound them, the stolen letters outlining Ray's betrayal, the affair that splintered the family years ago, echoes of David's own parental wounds, resonant and painful. Trust shattered, shards glinting in the low light, sharp and scattered, yet in the ruins, a faint longing stirred for the dinners before the secrets, the laughter untainted, the unity they all craved amid the pain. A distant memory. David exhaled slowly, his defensiveness ebbing into something raw, breath ragged. We can't undo it, but maybe we face it together. His voice, contemplative, carried a thread of hope, fragile as the steam rising from forgotten coffee cups, faint and curling. Sarah nodded, tears tracing her cheeks, her guilt softening into yearning, warm tracks. Michael unclenched his fists, the stress yielding to a quiet ache for what might still be salvaged, releasing tension. In the oppressive hush, amid the rich tapestry of half-eaten meals and flickering candles, they lingered on the edge, longing for redemption, for the family to reform from the ashes, tentative and glowing. In the suffocating hush that followed, the family splintered into silence, chairs scraping back as bodies fled the table's toxic orbit, harsh and retreating. Hours blurred into a gritty dawn, the house's walls closing in like a vice on their raw nerves, squeezing tight. Yet, beneath the oppressive weight of betrayal's residue, tentative threads of hope wove through their racing thoughts. Fragile visions of rebuilding, each soul adrift in contemplation, charting solitary paths across the ruins of trust, shadowed and winding. I can't hold it together anymore, Emily's chest heaved, the words she'd just unleashed. I knew about the letters all along, still echoing in her skull like a pulse she couldn't silence, throbbing relentlessly. The dining room table stretched between them, a scarred oak battlefield littered with half-eaten plates, the metallic tang of cooling beef lingering in her nostrils, mixing with the faint, acrid bite of her own sweat, sharp and personal. Sarah's fork clattered against porcelain, the sound fracturing the hush, brittle and echoing. She stared at Emily, eyes wide, pupils swallowing the dim lamplight that pooled unevenly across the room's faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, like skin sloughing off after too many buried secrets, ragged and revealing. You... what? Sarah's voice cracked, not sharp but frayed, threads of guilt unraveling from her core, loose and painful. She needed them to see it. Her mistakes weren't malice, just desperate grabs for connection. But now, judgment loomed in Michael's silence, in Emily's unblinking gaze, and Sarah felt the old shadow stir, the urge to twist words, to plead until they pitied her instead of pushing her away, instinctive and clawing. Michael shifted in his chair, the wooden legs scraping the linoleum with a low groan that vibrated through the floorboards, resonant and uneasy. His hands, calloused from years at the mill, pressed flat against the tablecloth, knuckles whitening not from anger, but from the effort to glue the pieces back, strained and futile. Harmony. This fragile web he'd spun to keep them from splintering. But Emily's confession pried at the seams, exposing the rot he'd ignored. His own ache, the way he'd sidestepped her pain to preserve the illusion of us, a hollow construct. "Emily," he murmured, voice low and steady, though his pulse thrummed in his ears like distant thunder, building. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" The question wasn't accusation. It was a plea, his fear clawing up. Conflict would unravel them all, leave him adrift in the wreckage of what he'd enabled, a looming void. Emily's throat burned, dry as the dust motes swirling in the slanted light, parched and irritated. She'd wanted closure, trust rebuilt on honest ground, but hesitation had chained her until now, heavy links. The letters, those crumpled confessions Sarah had hidden, Michael's quiet complicity in the cover-up, had festered inside her, a slow poison eroding the family she'd fought to reclaim, corrosive and deep. Tears welled, hot and unbidden, spilling over as her mask shattered, warm trails. She pushed back from the table, chair tipping precariously, and the sob escaped. A raw, guttural sound that filled the room's oppressive corners, echoing off the walls. "Because I was scared. Scared you'd all leave me behind again, like before. I thought if I just waited, pretended, maybe we could fix it without breaking." Her hands trembled, not from cliché frailty, but from the weight of unleashing it all, her shadow exposed. The avoidance that had let wounds suppurate, festering openly. Sarah reached across the table then, tentative, her fingers brushing Emily's sleeve. Soft cotton, warm from the body's heat, a fleeting contact. "We won't. Not this time." The words tumbled out, laced with her insecurity, but genuine, a bid for understanding that pierced her manipulative veil, raw and reaching. Michael nodded, slow, his passive stance cracking as he stood, rounding the table to pull Emily into a loose embrace. The scent of his aftershave, faint pine and soap, mingled with the room's stale remnants, grounding them in familiarity. In that clutch of limbs, tentative and uneven, the air shifted. Not lightened, but pierced by possibility, a subtle breach. Emily leaned into it, the sob easing into shaky breaths, ragged and slowing. Fractured, yes, but perhaps mendable. Steps forward, uncertain, glimmered on the horizon. Conversations without masks, trust pieced back, one raw admission at a time, deliberate and hopeful. 3 days later, the house hung heavy with unspoken rot, its walls absorbing the fallout like damp rot in the bones, musty and pervasive. Alex wandered the dim corridors, Emily's revelation a festering knot in his gut, unease twisting tighter with each creak of the floorboards, ominous and echoing. The oppressive air thickened, laced with the faint must of neglect. Yet a tentative hope stirred amid the psychological churn. Identity beyond the betrayal's grip, a faint outline. His fingers brushed the packed bag in the hall, the threshold to reckoning looming just beyond, shadowed and inevitable. That's when Michael realized the house had grown too quiet. The kind of silence that swallowed footsteps and left only echoes of what used to be, hollow and resounding. 3 days since Emily's confession about the letters, and now Alex's backpack slumped by the front door, like a discarded skin. A hastily scrawled note pinned beneath its strap. "Need space to breathe. Don't follow." The words blurred in Michael's vision, his pulse thudding low in his ears as he stood in the dim hallway. The faint scent of Alex's cologne, sharp citrus undercut by sweat, still clinging to the air, lingering like regret. He crumpled the paper in his fist, the edges biting into his palm, sharp and real. Confront the truth, he told himself. Facilitate healing. But this was disintegration staring back, his fear uncoiling like smoke from a hidden fire, slow and choking. He turned toward the kitchen, where Emily hunched over the sink, scrubbing a single mug with mechanical fury, her knuckles whitening against the porcelain, suds foaming. David sat at the table, staring at his untouched coffee, the steam long dissipated into nothingness, cold and flat. "Alex is gone," Michael said, voice flat as he dropped the note onto the scarred wood. It landed with a soft rustle, pulling their eyes to it like a magnet, inevitable. Emily froze, sponge dripping suds onto the linoleum in steady plips, wet and rhythmic. Her shoulders sagged, the determination in her posture fracturing, slumping. Gone. Just like that? She wiped her hands on her jeans, but they came away smeared, trembling not from cold, but from the weight pressing down, heavy and crushing. Reconciliation. She chased it through the haze of those letters, the betrayals they'd all danced around. Elusive. But abandonment? It clawed at her now, raw and immediate, her fear blooming hot in her chest, scorching. She crossed to the table, snatching the note, reading it twice as if the words might rearrange themselves, desperate. We were supposed to talk, fix this. David's chair scraped back, a low grind that set Michael's teeth on edge, grating. The older man's face, lined with years of unspoken resentments, twisted, vulnerable, yes, but edged with that old resolve to shield his failures, hardened. He'll come back, David muttered, but his voice cracked on the last word, betraying the lie, fragile. Failing as a father, losing the love he'd always taken for granted, it hit him square, stirring the bitterness toward his own parents he'd buried deep, resurfacing. He pushed to his feet, pacing the narrow space between counter and fridge, the floorboards creaking under his weight, protesting. This is on all of us. The secrets, the pretending. I should have said something sooner. Emily's breath hitched, a sharp inhale that shattered the fragile calm, breaking. Pretending? You think that's new? Her words spilled out, laced with the conflict she'd held back for so long. Avoidance crumbling under the pressure, collapsing. Tears welled, spilling over as she slammed the note down, forceful. I knew about the letters, Dad. I carried that weight while you both looked away. And now Alex? He's the one who finally sees it. We're all just masks, hiding the rot. She sank into a chair, elbows on the table, face buried in her hands. The sob that followed was guttural, peeling back the harmony they'd clung to, exposing the jagged edges beneath. Michael's enabling silence, David's shadowed grudges, her own unresolved fears, raw and bleeding. Michael reached out, hand hovering near her shoulder, but pulled back, his own pain too close to the surface, avoidance whispering to let it pass, seductive. Yet hope flickered, faint as dawn through grime-streaked windows, in the way they didn't look away this time, steadfast. The kitchen pressed in, oppressive with the ghosts of meals shared and words unsaid, haunting. But in the break, something stirred. A tentative path toward mending what Alex's absence had laid bare, emerging. Unease settled over them like dust, thick and insistent, urging them to face the voids left behind, unyielding. 3 days blurred into a suffocating haze, the empty house pressing down like an unyielding fog, each creak amplifying the void left by Alex's flight, resonant and empty. Emily, now Mia in the fractured mirror of her own unraveling, carried the confession's leaden echo in her chest, suspicion coiling tighter with every unanswered question, twisting. In the dim glow of her bedside lamp, hope flickered faintly amid the shadows. She traced the aunt's faded number on an old photo, fingers trembling as the past's buried thorns threatened to pierce anew, sharp and imminent. The faded scent of lavender soap clung to the letter in Sarah's hand. Yanking her back to that cramped attic room, Aunt Clara's voice cracking over the phone like brittle glass. Your father's secrets aren't yours to bury, girl. But they'll eat you alive if you try. The words echoing. Sarah's pulse thudded against her ribs, the paper crinkling under her grip, as she stared at the unlit screen of her phone in the dim kitchen light, shadows pooling. 3 days. The house echoed with absence since Alex bolted, his backpack still slumped by the door like a ghost refusing to fade, forlorn. Emily's confession about the letters, those damning notes from David's past, hidden in the attic, had cracked the foundation, but no one spoke of it. Not yet. Sarah's thumb hovered over the call button, her breath shallow, ragged. She needed answers, something to stitch the fraying edges of her guilt, desperate. Mia wasn't here. Mia was gone, dissolved into the ether of their fractured family. But Sarah carried her echo, the weight of confessions unspoken, heavy. With a swallow, She dialed the number she'd unearthed from an old address book, the one Clara had left behind years ago, dusty. The line rang twice before a raspy voice answered. Clara speaking. Aunt Clara? It's Sarah, Emily's daughter. Her words tumbled out, laced with the shame that had gnawed at her since the fight. Since she'd twisted truths to shield her own mistakes, corrosive. I need to talk. About Dad. About everything. A pause stretched, thick as the dust motes dancing in the slanted afternoon light, filtering through the blinds, suspended. Sarah's free hand traced the scarred wooden table, nails biting into the grain, painful. Emily shuffled in from the hallway, her face drawn, eyes flicking to the phone with that familiar conflict, determination warring with the urge to retreat, internal. David lingered behind her, arms crossed, his broad shoulders hunched as if bracing for another blow, tense. Clara's laugh came low, edged with something sharper, cutting. Sarah, been a while. What stirred you now? That business with the letters your mother found? Sarah's stomach twisted. How did she know? You remember? I confessed some things to them. About what I did. The lies I told to cover for Alex. But it's all tangled with Dad's history. The resentment he carries, from his own folks. I thought maybe you could… Help? Clara's tone sharpened, suspicion bleeding through like ink on wet paper, spreading. Child, your father's shadows run deep. He never forgave his parents for walking out, did he? Left him to fend for scraps, just like he fears doing to you all. But there's more. Things he buried when he married Emily. Affairs? No. Worse. Debts that drove his brother to the bottle. And me? I was the one who cleaned it up, while he played the stoic provider. David's face paled, his resolute mask fracturing as he stepped forward, voice raw, strained. What the hell is that? Sarah, hang up. But his eyes betrayed him, vulnerability cracking through, the fear of failing them all surging like bile, overwhelming. He reached for the phone, but Emily caught his arm, her grip fierce, conflicted tears welling as her own abandonment fears clawed to the surface, desperate. I can't avoid this anymore, Emily whispered, voice breaking the silence like a stone through ice, shattering. David, we have to face it. All of it. Sarah froze, the line buzzing with Clara's waiting breath, humming. Suspicion coiled in her chest. Had Aunt Clara known all along, manipulating from afar? Or was this the forgiveness she'd craved, raw and unforgiving? David's hand dropped, his resentment toward his past mirroring the hope flickering in his gaze, a tentative bridge over the chasm, emerging. For the first time, the masks shattered, words spilling free in the oppressive hush. Accusations, pleas, the gritty truth of their wounds laid bare, unfiltered. Yet beneath it, a fragile light, reconciliation's whisper, pulling them towards something unbroken, soft and insistent. Hours blurred into a haze as Sarah folded the letter away, its words coiling like smoke in her chest, lingering. Fear gnawed at the edges of her resolve, a quiet dread that the truths it hinted at would shatter more than memories, ominous. By evening, the family gathered around the scarred oak table, the air thick with unspoken weights, silverware clinking like distant warnings under the low hum of the chandelier, foreboding. Her hands trembled slightly as she passed the bread, the oppressive silence pressing in, laced with a fragile thread of hope that confession might mend what years had broken. Tentative. The metallic tang of overcooked roast beef lingered on David's tongue, turning each swallow into a reluctant admission, bitter and sticking. He set his fork down, the clink against the plate slicing through the silence like a blade testing flesh, sharp and deliberate. Across the scarred oak table, Sarah's eyes, red-rimmed from whatever ghost she'd been chasing, flicked up from her untouched peas, weary. Michael hunched beside her, his knuckles whitening around a water glass, the condensation beading like sweat under scrutiny, slick and cold. I can't eat this lie anymore, David said, his voice gravelly, scraped raw from years of swallowing pride. Hoarse. The words hung there, not heavy but insistent, pulling at the threads of their fragile evening. tugging. He leaned forward, elbows on the tablecloth stained with gravy spots from better nights. Dark reminders. It wasn't just that one time. The affair your mother confessed before she left. It was everything after. The way I let resentment fester, like rot in the walls. I blamed her, but it was me choosing silence over mending, night after night. Sarah's breath hitched, a sharp inhale that carried the faint lavender from the letter crumpled in her pocket. The one Aunt Clara had forced her to face, secrets spilling like ink on wet paper, staining. She wanted to twist it, to soften the edges with tears that always bought her a pass, but the shame coiled tighter, a serpent in her gut, squeezing. "Dad," she whispered, her voice threading hope through the ash of her fear, fragile. "I knew. Not all of it, but enough. And I covered for you once. With Michael. Told him it was just stress, work fights. I didn't want us to break." Her admission cracked open, revealing the manipulative pull she'd wielded like a shield, now rusted and useless, exposed, judged, rejected. The words echoed in her skull, but she pushed on, eyes pleading for the forgiveness she craved, a fragile light in the dim kitchen bulb's glow, flickering. Michael's chair scraped back an inch, the sound a low growl against the linoleum, primal. He avoided this, the raw ache of it all, preferring to smooth edges, enable the peace that never lasted, habitual. But tonight, the drive to confront clawed through his reluctance, fear of the family's shatter mirroring the void his mother's absence had carved, echoing. "Why now?" he demanded, voice steady but laced with the tremor of a boy who'd watched bonds fray like old rope, fraying. "Years of choices, Dad? You picked anger over us, every time. And Sarah—" He trailed off, glancing at his sister, the enabler in him warring with the need to heal, conflicted. "We could have talked, fixed it. But you both let it build, like a storm we all pretended wasn't coming." David met his son's gaze, vulnerability etching lines deeper into his face, the resolute core beneath it flickering like a candle in draft, unsteady. His own parents' shadows loomed, cold silences, unspoken failures he'd mirrored without realizing, fearing he'd lose these two forever if he didn't own it. A deep terror. "Because I'm scared, Michael. Scared I'll fail you both the way I was failed. But hiding? That's the real fracture." He reached across, hand hovering near Sarah's, not touching yet. An offer, tentative, laced with the hope of reconstruction amid the rubble, reaching. The clock ticked onward, each second a contemplative pulse, the oppressive weight of truths laid bare, pressing down, unyielding. Yet in the fear, the terror of irreparable cracks, a sliver of possibility gleamed. Not erasure, but exposure leading to something stronger, if they dared grasp it, glinting. Sarah's fingers twitched toward her father's, the first bridge in the breach, connecting. The silence stretched like a taut wire after dinner, David's gaze lingering on Sarah's haunted profile before he retreated to his room, heavy-lidded. Hours bled into the oppressive hush of night, regret coiling in his chest like smoke, choking. Sleep eluded him, thoughts circling the unspoken fractures in their home, relentless. By dawn, desperation clawed at the edges of his resolve, drawing him toward the shadowed corner of the attic where forgotten relics whispered of buried truths, faint and insistent. The absence of easy lies, the ones that once smoothed the edges of their evenings like invisible balm, now gone. Michael's fork rested idle beside his plate, the overcooked beef cooling into a congealed accusation, slick. Sarah's peas remained a green smear, untouched, her gaze now locked on the frayed tablecloth as if it held the script for what came next, searching. Emily shifted in her chair at the far end, her 14-year-old frame too small for the weight she carried, fingers absently tracing the wood grain until they stilled, deliberate. She had found it that afternoon, in the crawl space under the stairs, a slim leather journal wedged behind a loose baseboard, its pages brittle with age and secrets, crumbling. Desperation had driven her there, after overhearing Michael's hushed call to the lawyer about the house, the one Sarah pretended not to notice, tense. Emily's heart had pounded as she pried it free, dust motes swirling in the dim light like fleeing confessions, chaotic. Now, with the book clutched in her lap beneath the table, its cover warm against her thighs, she couldn't hold it back any longer, resolve hardening. "Mom," Emily said, her voice a thin thread pulling at the quiet, taut. She slid the journal forward, its spine cracking softly as it hit the oak, resonant. "I found this. It's yours." Sarah's breath caught, a sharp intake that echoed in the room's stale air, heavy with the scent of charred meat and unspoken debts. Acrid. Her hands, knuckles whitening around her napkin, didn't move to take it, frozen. Michael's eyes narrowed, flicking from the book to Sarah's face, the lines around his mouth deepening like cracks in dry earth, widening. He wanted this. The raw edge of truth, something to stitch them back together. But the fear gnawed at him. The possibility that peeling back these layers might leave nothing but shards. Terrifying. "What is it?" he asked, voice steady but laced with the effort of holding his own ghosts at bay, strained. He leaned forward, avoiding the pull of his unresolved ache. The way he'd let Sarah's silences enable his own retreats, habitual. Emily's fingers trembled, not from cold, but from the storm inside, the dread of this unraveling them all, brewing. She flipped it open to a marked page, the ink faded but legible. Sarah's looping script spilling regrets like spilled ink, dark. "Letters," Emily whispered, her words measured, each one a step toward the confrontation she'd dodged for years, deliberate. "I lied to Michael about the money, about why I left that night. The guilt eats me hollow. Emily deserves better than this shadow of a mother. And more. About Dad. About all of us." Sarah's face crumpled, not in defense, but in the slow bleed of admission, yielding. Shame flushed her cheeks, yet beneath it flickered something fragile, hope, perhaps, in the act of facing it, tentative. "I wrote those years ago," she murmured, reaching out at last, her touch on the page tentative, as if it might burn, hesitant. "Before I tried to make it right. I was lost, manipulating the pain to keep you close, to not lose you. But I want to own it now. Forgive me, or don't. I can't hide anymore." Michael's throat worked. The words he craved for healing caught against his fear of the fracture, lodged. He saw it in her eyes, the plea not for pity, but for a bridge across the betrayal. Earnest. Emily watched them both, her determination warring with the terror of abandonment, the journal a wedge that might split or seal, pivotal. Regret hung in the spaces between their breaths, thick and tangible, not as an end, but as the first reluctant step toward mending what the lies had torn, emerging. In that suspended moment, the kitchen's dim bulb cast long shadows, but for the first time, they didn't feel like prisons, just outlines waiting to be filled, open. The silence from that dinner clung like damp rot in the walls of their home, seeping into every corner over the next grueling day. Insidious. Michael's jaw tightened with each forced breath, Sarah's eyes hollowed by the ache of truths too sharp to voice, sunken. By evening, the family's frayed nerves demanded reckoning. An emergency huddle in the dim living room, where anguish simmered beneath fragile hopes of mending what was already splintering, bubbling. Outside, the distant rumble of a truck shifting gears on the empty street. Inside, David's breath, ragged and close, like gravel underfoot, rough. The kitchen light buzzed faintly, casting elongated shadows across the linoleum that peeled at the edges, revealing layers of forgotten spills, ragged. Michael sat rigid at the table, his hands flat on the wood, knuckles pale against the grain, tense. The beef from dinner congealed on his plate, a silent witness to the meal's abrupt collapse, accusing. Emily hovered by the sink, her back to them, rinsing a glass with mechanical precision. The water's hiss, the only sound breaking the standoff, steady. David paced the narrow space between stove and fridge, his slippers scuffing softly. Each step a measured concession to the vulnerability gnawing at his resolve. Reluctant. "We can't keep pretending," Michael said, his voice low, threaded with the drive to unearth what festered beneath their silences. Insistent. He leaned forward, eyes fixed on Emily's rigid shoulders. Emily, you knew. About the money. About Dad dipping into the accounts for his habits. You covered for him. Why? Emily's hands stilled under the faucet. Water dripped from the glass, pooling on the counter in erratic circles, spreading. She turned slowly, her face a mask of conflict, determination warring with the fear of rejection that had always pulled her back from the brink. Internal struggle. I was protecting us, Michael. All of us. If I'd said something sooner, it would have torn everything apart. Dad was trying, he is trying, to make it right. David stopped pacing, his broad frame slumping against the fridge door. The magnetized calendar fluttered slightly from the impact, dates blurring in his vision, indistinct. Resentment from his own fractured childhood surged, a shadow he couldn't outrun, twisting his parenting into half measures and hidden failures. Dark. No more protecting, he murmured, resolute but cracking, his fear of losing them sharpening every word, edged. I messed up. The gambling, the lies. It started small, like scratches you ignore until they scar. But Emily, you should have told me you knew. We could have faced it together. The air thickened, oppressive as the steam still rising from the sink, carrying the faint, acrid tang of overboiled vegetables, stinging. Michael's chair scraped back, a sharp protest against the enabling ache in his chest. The pain he'd sidestepped for years, propping up the family at the cost of his own unraveling. Costly. Faced it? Like you faced Mom leaving? Or how you've been resenting us for reminding you of her? His voice rose, anguish uncoiling like a spring, propelling him to his feet, forceful. Emily's eyes flashed, her avoidance shattering under the pressure. Don't you dare. She stepped forward, hand outstretched in plea, but Michael flinched away, his arm swinging out in raw reflex. It caught her shoulder, not hard, but enough to send her stumbling back against the counter. The glass shattered on the floor, shards scattering like brittle confessions, tinkling. David lunged, grabbing Michael's arm, his grip ironclad with paternal desperation. Enough, he roared, pulling them apart, his own face contorted in the mirror of his fears, failing them all over again, twisted. They froze, breaths sinking in the sudden hush, ragged. The pieces of glass glinted under the light, sharp. Emily slid down the cabinet, tears carving paths through the tension, her drive for reconciliation flickering like a distant hope amid the wreckage, faint. Michael sank into his chair, hands trembling not from rage, but from the exposed rawness, the family's bonds fraying yet not fully severed, holding. David knelt amid the fragments, voice breaking. We're still here. We fix this. Together. In that suspended moment, anguish bloomed sharp and unrelenting, but beneath it, a fragile thread of possibility, hope's quiet insistence against the dark, persistent. Hours bled into days under the weight of unspoken fractures, the kitchen's buzz fading to a distant hum in Michael's fractured memories, echoing. Across the shadowed divide of the house, Alex paced her dim room, the air thick with the residue of chaos, peeling walls mirroring their unraveling bonds, ragged. Yet in the oppressive hush, a tentative hope stirred, her fingers hovering over the phone, poised to sever the ties that bound them all in tense limbo, hovering. The kitchen, dawn's gray seeped through the blinds. Alex shoved back from the table, his chair scraping like a confession dragged out, harsh. Emily burst through the swinging door, her robe clutched at the throat, eyes wild with the fragments of sleep shattered by the voices below, frantic. What's happening? David, tell me he's not. Her words tangled, but she pressed on, driven by the knot in her chest, the fear that one more silence would sever them all, urgent. She reached for Alex's arm, fingers brushing his sleeve, but he flinched away, the motion a blade twisting in her gut, sharp. David stood frozen by the sink, water still dripping from a glass he'd gripped too long, his knuckles mapped with old scars from workshop fights he never spoke of, etched. Vulnerability cracked his voice when he finally spoke. Son, wait, I see it now. The ways I've failed you, carrying my father's poison like it's mine to pour out. Res.